Hello, everyone. I am just back from church and I did a presentation on my trip to Israel for those who were present. But I realized a few people couldn't make it. And so, what I'm going to do is put up my slides and narrate behind those so you can get a chance to see what I did in Israel and my trip. So, here we go. One of the fun things about going on a trip is you get to see things that are sort of familiar, but maybe they're just a little bit unexpected. Maybe a little bit like this ping pong table that I saw on the beach at Tel Aviv the morning after we arrived. Hmm. Israel's located on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, just north of Egypt and south of Turkey. Israel has three kind of north-south zones that you can see. To the left is the coastal plain, and there was a road from ancient times that would go from Egypt all the way up north into Syria or Damascus. In the middle, where the squiggles are, is the hill country. Jerusalem is located up, and it's one of the reasons why we always say we're heading up to Jerusalem. And then on the right, you can see that line is the Jordan Valley. It follows the Jordan River from the Sea of Galilee and down into the Dead Sea. Our trip began in Tel Aviv and we drove up the coastal highway to Caesarea Maritima. There are two Caesareas, and that's why they're designated. This is the one that's on the Mediterranean. It was built by King Herod the First and named in honor of the Caesar at that time, who was Octavius. Now, King Herod the First, or Herod the Great, is an interesting Herod. There are three mentioned in the New Testament. This is the Herod who is mentioned in the Bible story with the wise men. I put the question there on the slide, who is God? Because Herod seemed to have dual allegiances. The city of Caesarea has a huge temple, which is meant to honor Rome. And yet, Herod the Great also built the temple in Jerusalem, which was to honor Israel's God. You can see why he wouldn't be a popular person amongst the religious leaders of that time. Caesarea was huge. It had a theater, it had a palace, a hippodrome, a place where there would be horse races. And in the center there, you can see that huge temple that I mentioned. Right to the left of it is the artificial port that Herod built. It was quite an undertaking in his day. The theater still stands at the water's edge. It has been rebuilt a little bit, but it's still an amazing space. And we were told that if you are an artist, you want to sing at this theater, it shows that you've really made it to the top. Walking from the theater, you get a chance to see a little bit of the size of this town. The circle of the hippodrome remains. You can imagine the horses and chariots whizzing around that very steep corner. Herod thought of himself as a man about town. He was a patron of the Olympics, and he also invented second and third place in different games. Before that, it was a winner takes all situation. You can still see the outlines of the port today. Turning around and looking back towards the town, if you can imagine all that green grass being water, that is where the ships would have docked. The temple would have been above those arches with that large staircase to the left. An interesting archaeological find from several years ago is a stone called the Pilate Stone. And you can see where I've drawn an arrow. It actually says Pontius Pilate. That's the VS, Pontius, and then Pilate. It's always exciting when you find things that mention people or places in the Bible. Some interesting things that happened at Caesarea that we could read about in the book of Acts are in Acts chapter 12, the story of Herod II. Herod the Great's grandson, who was at that amphitheater receiving the praise of all the people around him who said, "Oh, he's just like a god." Herod took that glory for himself, it reads, and God was not pleased. God judges Herod for that presumption and pride on his part. Secondly, there's the story of Peter and Cornelius. Cornelius lives in Caesarea, and God sends Peter to tell him, a Gentile, the good news about Jesus. And finally, in Acts 24 and 25, we read how Paul was imprisoned for 2 years in Caesarea. We next went northeast through a pass in the mountains up to the Jezreel Valley, where we visited Carmel. You can see that at the top, down to Megiddo, and over to Nazareth. 2 Kings 18 tells us the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Elijah was a mighty prophet that lived during a very wicked time of Israel's history, and God had sent a drought for 3 years to try to get Israel's attention. Elijah comes back and tells the king, King Ahab, that the drought is about to be over. But before that happens, he wants to make a demonstration of God's power. And so he invites the prophets of the other deity in the area, Baal, to come, sort of to a spiritual showdown. He has them build an altar and put a sacrifice on it. And he says, I'll build an altar and put a sacrifice over here. And let's see which God can bring down fire from the heaven to burn the sacrifice. All morning, the prophets of Baal cry out and dance and cut themselves. And Elijah's a bit snarky, actually, in the commentary. He says, well, maybe your God's asleep, or maybe your God's out relieving himself behind the back of the house there, and that's why he can't hear you. And finally, when they've given up, Elijah decides, well, he's going to make God work a little harder for him. And so he asks that barrels of water be poured over the sacrifice and the stones until the whole thing is sopping wet. And then he prays and asks God to bring fire. We're told that God answers that prayer, that fire comes down, it burns up the sacrifice, it burns up the stones, it burns up the water that's all around it. And the people respond by saying, the Lord, He is God. But there's still the matter of the rain. And Elijah prays for rain, and he sees a little cloud coming. And he tells King Ahab, get on your chariot and hightail it back, because the rain is coming. And when you look over this valley, you realize that the road that Ahab had to travel on would have become nothing but a mud pit once the rain started. So just a little interesting tidbit on that story. From Mount Carmel, we headed southeast down the valley to Megiddo. Megiddo is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. It's Joshua defeated the king who was there. King Josiah met his death there. But another interesting mention of Megiddo is in Revelation 16:16, where it talks about the last battle being fought at Armageddon. Armageddon is just another way of saying the valley of Megiddo. And so it symbolizes a place where big battles happened. Will there be a literal battle in that valley at Megiddo? We don't know, but the reference is to something large. There's an interesting connection if you wanted to check with Zechariah 12. Zechariah says that when Jesus comes back, there will be an awareness of who he is, and there will be great sorrow at what Jesus was put through. It will be as strong and painful as the mourning for when King Josiah died at Megiddo. Here you can see some of the ruins of Megiddo and how high it is, what a strategic place it is as a fortress above the valley in the background there. Can you guess what this is? It was found in Megiddo in the horses' stables, and it is a manger. We often think of Jesus being put in a wooden manger, but I wonder if it might have been a stone manger like this one. Crossing the valley, we headed north to Nazareth, and a rainbow followed us most of the way there. It's where Joseph took Mary and Joseph on their way back from Egypt. They took that long coastal road that I pointed out and then headed through the valley of Jezreel, just like we did, until they came to Nazareth. It's where Jesus grew up and lived until that day when in the synagogue he angered all of his hometown peeps who wanted him to be their special boy. And they took him out to a hill and they tried to throw him over. Jesus escaped the crowd and went to live in Capernaum. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Was this the hill? We don't know, but it's called Mount Precipice. So someone thought that might be a good name for it. What's more interesting for me to imagine is that it was a place that Jesus, as a young boy, as a teen, as a young man, might often have walked up to, looking out over the valley and imagining all that God had done to his people, and also wondering what his role was in the continuing story of God's work for Israel. Evening was falling, and so we went down the mountain and into Nazareth. During Jesus' time, a small and insignificant city. There we visited the Church of the Annunciation. Did the angel really come and talk to Mary in the cave that's below this church? I don't know. But the thing that really caught me as I visited this place was Mary's yes. We all have that opportunity, don't we, to say yes to God. This place honors Mary for the yes that brought Jesus into the world. Lining the sides of the church is beautiful artwork from different parts of the world. Just a few minutes walk from the Church of the Annunciation is the Sisters of Nazareth convent. And there we saw something very, very interesting. This place was bought in the 1800s by some nuns who came from France and wanted to establish a convent there. And they're still there. They care for deaf children. Well, as they were digging to set up the foundation for the church, what did they come across? Of course, some ruins. Ruins of an old Byzantine church, and they began to wonder why was there a church in this space. And as they kept digging, as they had people come in and help them, they discovered just recently now a first century home in Nazareth. Could this have been the home that Jesus grew up in? Again, you don't know, but you don't know that it wasn't. And as our guide said, perhaps Jesus, even if he didn't grow up in this home, might have come to visit it one day. Anyhow, it was an amazing thing to see. There is a tomb underneath that, although I've just been reading recently that they think the tomb may date to after the house was no longer used. But some people think it could be the tomb of Joseph, Jesus's father, who died when he was in his youth. The next morning, we headed up to the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent much of his ministry. And I wanted to focus on three sites and just kind of show you where they are on the map. The lowest one on the left is Magdala, where perhaps Mary of Magdalene lived. Up on the top is where there is a church commemorating the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, you don't know exactly what mountain Jesus was on, but it probably was one of these mountains, and this is as good a guess as any. And then underneath that is Capernaum, which is Jesus' adult home. After hearing so much about the Sea of Galilee, it was really a treat to stand on its shores and look across the water to the eastern side, just imagining all the things that happened on that water and around that water. And maybe it's not fish that you're eating, but hamburgers that you're looking for. I got this picture as I was walking along a road by the lake and thought it would just be kind of fun to see. And did you notice that the lettuce and the tomato are on the bottom of the hamburger bun? Maybe that would keep our buns a little less soggy. So here we are above the Sea of Galilee, a beautiful hillside. Um, who knows where Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount. But one of the things that caught me is how theatrical Jesus is, in a sense. God gave the laws to Moses on Mount Sinai, and it was easy to imagine that Jesus chose to bring the people up to a higher place so that he could give them that sense of receiving some words from God. When you look through the Sermon on the Mount, you realize Jesus isn't saying anything new, is he? He's really repeating what Moses had gotten from God, but he's boring in. He's saying, no, it's not just murder, it's anger. Jesus calls his followers to be perfect. Not that we don't do anything wrong, but to have hearts that are perfectly committed to love like God. Like many of the other sites we saw, this also had a church, a beautiful garden. This is a convent area, monastery, and it was a beautiful place to spend a few minutes. I found a quiet spot overlooking the lake and just tried to imagine what it must have been like to hear Jesus's words for the first time. Leaving the mountain, we headed down back to the sea, down into Capernaum. And this is a beautiful view. You can see how it's located just right on the edge of the sea there. The center, there is a church that's over what some people think was Peter's house. Of course, one can never know. In the front area, you can see a beautiful temple. I believe that's from the 4th century. And underneath that temple actually is a 1st century synagogue, temple or synagogue. They've done a lot of excavating here. It's very exciting to see how large the city is. It wasn't actually until I was putting this slideshow together that I saw how many things happened at Capernaum. Peter and Andrew were from Capernaum. John and James, the son of Zebedee, were from Capernaum. And as we said before, once Jesus is kicked out of Nazareth, Jesus settles here. Despite all the things that happened in Capernaum, it doesn't seem like they really believed Jesus's message. And so he speaks about that in Matthew 11:23. Here, Jesus asked Peter to catch a fish when people come around asking for a coin to pay the temple tax. Jesus heals a man possessed by a spirit. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. Jesus heals the paralyzed man. Remember the man that has the 4 friends who open up the roof? That happened in Capernaum. And Jesus walks on water as the disciples are sailing across the sea to Capernaum. And it's in Capernaum that Jesus will give that wonderful sermon saying, I am the bread of life. Here you can see some of the ruins with the temple or synagogue on the left, and the church that's over where Peter's house might have been. And then I just took some time to sit again by the sea and ponder what it was been like for Jesus to live here, to walk and see the Sea of Galilee from this vantage point. Next was lunch. Peter's fish, as it's sometimes called. Lots of bones, but good tasting anyhow. After lunch, we headed to what is called the city of Magdala. I've been doing a little reading about it, and it's possible that actually the real Magdala was located a little bit further south. But what's amazing about this place is the ruins and also the discovery of a 1st century temple. These trenches were probably used to bring in water, and many of the houses here seem to have ritual baths, so that water may have been diverted off into those ritual baths. This area was abandoned for a long time, and in 2006, the Catholic Church bought some sites here to build a hostel, a pilgrimage place. And of course, you always need to get a permit and an archaeologist on site when you build in not only in Israel, but in Turkey and in Greece. And in the first day that they came in, they uncovered this amazing first century synagogue, which has been excavated, and you can see the mosaics in front of you. It's really a beautiful place. The stone chest that looks like it's in the middle there is one of the earliest representations of a menorah. That's not the real one, that's in a museum, and it's covered by a canopy. And so that's wonderful because you can actually see the mosaics. Often places they're covered up so that the sun doesn't ruin them. Did Jesus preach in this synagogue? Well, I would guess that the chances would be pretty high that he did. Of course, one of the reasons that Magdala is so well known to us is because of Mary Magdala, or Mary the Magdalene. And there's a couple of interesting stories about that. The first is that Migdol, which is Magdala in Hebrew, actually means tower. And do you remember how Peter was called the Rock? That was his nickname. Some people say, well, Mary wasn't really from Magdala, but she was a very important and strong woman in the early church. And so that's why she was called Mary Magdala, or Mary Tower. Above and over a bit from the synagogue is a church, beautiful church building. This is the atrium of the women. There are 8 pillars around it, and women whose names are mentioned in the Bible are inscribed on them, including one that is left empty for women of all time who love God and live by faith. This is a shot of the main chapel. The whole church is called Duc in Altum, which means put out into the deep. A call for us not to put our boats out into the deep, perhaps, but to walk in new and fresh ways with Jesus. There's a second chapel on the lower level. This one has this beautiful painting. I don't know if you can kind of grasp how large it is. You can see the ceiling there with the ceiling light. It's called Encounter, and it memorializes that moment when the woman with the issue of blood says, if I can just touch the hem of Jesus's garment, I'll be healed. And of course, she is. Leaving Magdala, it was time to get onto the boats ourselves to get out into the Sea of Galilee. But first, we had a little side trip. In the 1980s, due to a drought, the Sea of Galilee's level had actually lowered, and 2 brothers discovered in the sand along the shore this old boat, which took a lot of energy and intelligence to get out of the sand and into a place where it could be preserved. And so you can go to a museum now and see it. It has the preservation, it's all been finished, and it was just cool, just very amazing to see a boat that was that old and what people would have traveled to go fishing on the Sea of Galilee. We had a larger boat and a very serene evening with a beautiful sunset that we could enjoy as we were out on the Sea of Galilee. Our time in Galilee was very quick, too quick, but it was time to get on the bus and head down the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem. Now, the reason I put this slide up is because often we talk about Samaria, and we know that Samaria is a place that Jews would avoid because Samaritans and Jews were not on good talking terms, and it could be even violent for Jews that headed into Samaritan territory or vice versa. So instead of coming down on the left or the west side of the Jordan, Jews would cross the river and then they would head south on the eastern side of the Jordan. So when Jesus says he needs to go through Samaria, he doesn't need to go to Samaria at all. There were other safer ways he could have gotten down south. But Jesus chose to go into Samaria, had a large portion of his ministry there, teaching and preaching, including, of course, that famous story about Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. The Jordan River is at the base of the mountains, and those mountains on the other side are actually Jordan. The Jordan River is a barrier, boundary between the two of them, and that's agricultural land in that little valley that's down there, and then it comes up into these hills and into the hills of the Judean wilderness, which are actually behind us. I didn't get any pictures of this, but someone asked about the produce of Israel. One of the things that they've started growing is dates, so there are a lot of date palms as you're traveling down the Jericho Valley. We're on our way to the baptismal site, the traditional baptismal site of Jesus, which is at the very top above the Dead Sea there. But I wanted to show you this map because the baptismal site is also the traditional site where Israel crossed the Jordan River and came over into the Promised Land. So here we are at the Jordan River. And as I mentioned, not only were people getting baptized from this side of the river, but people were coming from the Jordan side of the river down to be baptized as well. We are many people, Paul says, but there is one Lord and one baptism. From the Jordan River, it was time to make our way up to Jerusalem. And we did that by following the road through the Judean wilderness, a place where David, John the Baptist, and Jesus all hung out. It was a very dramatic place. We stopped at an overlook, and you just wondered how many stories were in that wilderness. The next morning began at the top of the Mount of Olives, and you can see the blue line there, and where it ends in the center is where we started. And when we turned around, this was the view that we had of Jerusalem on the other side. It was very easy to imagine Jesus looking over at Jerusalem and weeping for the destruction that he knew was going to happen. And then, of course, Jesus spent the last night of his life on the Mount of Olives. And sometimes we think of these places as being serene and quiet and pristine. But our guide had told us that often when people come to the city for a Passover festival, for instance, there would be thousands of people. And where would they all stay? He said he could imagine that the hillside of the Mount of Olives was full of people camping out, so that when Jesus was there of his disciples, it wasn't quite the quiet that we imagined. The Church of All Nations, built at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, is surrounded by a garden of olive trees. I doubt this was the Garden of Gethsemane, but it helps you again imagine that Jesus did spend a night here praying before he passed away. And this amazing church tries to capture that feeling of evening when you go inside. It's a very quiet and contemplative place as Jesus is contemplating and struggling over his coming death. The Mount of Olives is behind us now, and we're walking down into the Kidron Valley and up to the Lion's Gate of Jerusalem. And Jesus would have come through this valley on his way back and forth through his time in the Jerusalem area. It was probably a bustling, jostling place then, just as it is today. This gate is wide enough for one car, but it's a two-way street. You can imagine pedestrians, motorcyclists, and cars all trying to get in and out that one gate. Of course, the city has several gates, but this is the one we came in through. We grabbed something to eat, some Jewish bagels. You can see how huge those are, some falafel, and some pomegranate juice to fortify us as we kept moving into Jerusalem. These pieces of marble date back to the 1st century. Jesus would have stood on something like this, if not these exact stones, when he came into Jerusalem. And our first stop was a place that I'm sure you've heard about, the Pool of Bethesda, the place that Jesus went and found a man lying by the side who had been sick and had no one to help him into the water when the waters were troubled and an angel would come and others might get healed. Jesus says, "Take up your mat and walk." And the man took up his mat and walked. What a wonderful story. There's a beautiful church nearby that has great acoustics. And it was wonderful to be in that and hearing different groups, tour groups singing Amazing Grace or How Great Thou Art or Alleluia. It was a very meaningful part of the tour. Now our steps took us on the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, which traditionally is the road that Jesus walked up to the cross from his trial. Whether or not these were indeed the roads, it was very easy to imagine as you were on them what it would have been like to go through these narrow streets, businesses bustling around you, slightly uphill to where Jesus would finally die. As I pondered this, I thought how hard it was for him to put a step in front of the other. How often it's hard for us to put a step in front of the other, and Jesus knows what that's like. There are 2 sites that have been traditionally considered as good options for where Jesus might have died. This is the newer of the sites. It was chosen because the rock looks like a skull, and we were told that Jesus was taken and crucified near Golgotha, or the place of a skull. And there is a garden tomb not far at all from where this is. So this was one of the places that we visited. The more traditional site is found at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we went into this church. Again, it was full of people, and sometimes you want to have these very amazing quiet moments where you're contemplating what happened. But when Jesus died, it wasn't quiet and contemplative. It was a mess. There were people thronging and shouting and all. And so part of me didn't mind the fact that things were so full and packed because it felt maybe even a little more authentic. If the line's not too long, you can come to this altar, and you see at the bottom on both sides of the altar that there is rock. And so this is built over a rocky place where Jesus's cross may have been placed. If you head downstairs, then you can enter in through a passageway and go down a tunnel and come to this tomb where some people think Jesus was laid on the night that he died. But 3 days after Jesus was placed in a tomb, he was no longer there. The women came to find him, and the angel said, "Don't be afraid, but he's not here. He's risen just as he said." And they're able to go into the tomb and see that it is empty. But they have to tell his disciples, Jesus is going to go back ahead of you into Galilee. So head there and you will meet him. They don't go right away because we know Jesus meets them in an upper room that night and the week after that. But eventually they do make it back to Galilee, and they're out on their boats, and they see on the shore side that Jesus has made a fire. He's cooking some fish, and he's waiting to talk with them. Jesus hung around Galilee for several weeks. He talked to them. He explained what was going on, what they were going to be doing. And then one day he led them up to a mountain, and before their eyes, he rose up into the heavens. And now we know that one day he will come again. We don't know when, but we know it will be a wonderful time, and we're looking forward to seeing Jesus face to face, as his disciples did those many years ago.